So tell me about the paper that you're working on right now on music theory.
Music theory. So it's about well, it starts off with Al-Kindi's theory of music and the correspondences that different musical notes have with the elements and the seasons and so forth. And it goes on to talk about this concept of nostalgia and how different songs, they evoke the images of different colors, different seasons, etc. And then it looks at more sort of mystical Arabic literature pertaining to music and music theory. And it develops this idea of nostalgia into divine nostalgia, and the idea that music evokes the oneness of God, because by hearing a harmony, by hearing the polyphony of different sounds coming together, it kind of simulates this oneness, as in Tawheed, and it evokes the memory of God. So it's sort of got two dimensions of nostalgia. So music evokes nostalgia in a worldly sense, and it reminds us of different creations and allows us to make associations between different things, but it also makes us nostalgic for God, which is obviously a really profound and beautiful concept.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I know that famously Rumi begins his Mathnawi with that couplet, right, about the reed being sort of pulled out of the reed bed, and its sort of mournful cry being basically an expression of that very longing to return to the divine. I was just thinking about that this morning, actually, and yesterday I was kind of messed around on the guitar a little bit, and I'm very sort of influenced by, I do very strange tuning on my guitar, and I'm sort of always, I think for a long time I was unconscious of why I was doing this, but now it just makes sense given my kind of, my background in Sufism. I kind of try to channel some of that energy, but then it's not sort of only Eastern. It's not.
The timbre of a reed flute, it does have that yearning quality. The elongation of the sound. It has this. It's hard to conceptualize, but I think you know what I mean. I mean, I for example, in
it's an amazing sound, isn't it? Yeah.
And they use it a lot in dervish muqabalis and turning ceremonies. You often have the reed flute featuring, so which is fitting. The return to God, the return to God through mysticism.
Do you think AI can help us return to God?
A short answer of that, I think, is no, because I think that it's drawing on a type of human intellection which is the kind which we should be subordinating and not encouraging. I think that, I take a very kind of medieval approach to human intellect in the idea that there are gradations and different degrees of intellection, and like Ibn Sina, like Al-Farabi, I'm a very strong believer that there is such thing as an active intellect, a kind of atemporal and perfect storehouse, so to speak, of intellectual principles. And then I think also subservient to that, you also have this lower intellect, which is connected to the nafs, the lower part of the soul, and it's concerned more with bodily needs and with appetitive drives and so forth. And I think my fundamental concern.
These are sort of survival instincts, of course, but then, sorry to interrupt, but the okay, I don't know. Sorry, keep going. Yeah.
No, but absolutely. This lower soul, this lower intellect, it is essential for our survival as worldly beings living in the world. It has its function. But as human beings, drawing on the Aristotelian sort of triad of ontology, you have this idea that human beings have not only the vegetative soul, sensitive soul, but also the intellectual soul. I got that right, didn't I? The three.
Yeah.
So this whole triad is, it's essential. It's important that they're working together. But ultimately, as human beings, we should really be focusing on the top part of that triangle. We should be focusing on cultivating a higher intellect, which is ultimately unaffiliated with bodily drives. And AI, as I think,
unaffiliated completely. Oh, ultimately, I guess. But I was just going to make the point that and this is the paradox, right? That it is somehow through, because we're not outside of our bodies, of course, but it's through bodily practices, bodily disciplinary sort of religious spiritual practices, that we come to connect with, ultimately, and this is the aim of connecting with the intellect with a capital I, right? And your point is also that, if I just may quickly mention that there's an overemphasis on the survival instincts and that which keeps us alive, right? I had it put, which are necessary, but that's not the whole story, right? I had it put like this, that you know, in sort of our modern condition is such that we basically only focus on the needs of the stomach and the genitals. Not only, but there's like an overemphasis.
Yeah. And Al-Ghazali talks about that a lot, those particular two drives.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right that the body is essential in order for us to actually access the higher intellect in the first place, because it's our carrier, it's our medium, right? But I think, I mean, even just looking at Islamic spirituality, for example, there is this notion, particularly among Al-Ghazali and other Sufi writers, that you start with physical actions like prayer and ritual and things which you are physically taught and involve the body, engage that physical part of the intellect. But as you become more and more attuned to God, you eventually stop needing those things. And you get to this immediate apprehension of the divine, whereby I think, as Al-Ghazali says in his Deliverance from Error, you get the light of God shining directly into your heart, and you don't need to summon that through any kind of physical gestures. And of course, you know, that's a very advanced mystical state to be in, and I don't imagine many people reach that in this mortal life. But there is this notion that you can and ultimately should supersede these bodily drives, even if they're necessary at the beginning. And AI, as I'm sure we'll talk about more later, artificial intelligence, it completely cuts off this whole possibility of higher intellection. It thinks it's building higher intellection because that's the very nature of artificial intelligence, but it's ultimately sort of stuck on this material level and satisfying worldly drives, satisfying the body. And I mean, I'm sure there's a lot to say about that, but what are your perspectives on that?
Oh no, that's awesome. Thanks so much. Well, I was thinking about, you know, just a sort of a working definition, just, you know, of AI, or artificial intelligence. I've heard it put something along the lines of basically trying to replicate ultimately all human functions, whether, you know, vaticinative or actual physical and so forth, in sort of machine format. That's the end goal. Well, I wanted to actually, building on what you just said, raise some questions, or sort of, well, raise some questions around the very notion of intellect or intelligence that's posited in the context of artificial intelligence, because it's, as you mentioned prior to, before we started recording, but the sort of the traditionalist understanding of being totally focused on the horizontal level. It's intelligence which is in very much in this world. It's worldly. You know, how do we get from A to B to C, and make this, that, and the other, and sort of look at all this massive amounts of raw data and sort of crunch it, and you know, through machine learning, and sort of generate results and actions within seconds, where human beings would potentially take hours to do the same thing. But if not a lot longer, in terms of reading sort of, this is from the documentary, Do You Trust This Computer, right? Have this radiologist saying, look, these machines have basically been fed 1 billion images, and they, of x-rays and things like that, and it takes them literally moments to pinpoint whatever's wrong in a patient, whereas a radiographer who spent 4 years training will take him hours. Well, I can't remember, a lot longer, not hours. But so that's a type of intelligence which is divorced from a sense of anything that's higher than that, right? Which is ultimately, from a traditional understanding of things, in all the traditions, right? It's well, sticking with Christianity and Islam for now, and Hinduism. It's about ultimately apprehending God, as you said, right? I know, I remember reading a long time ago that Saint Augustine has an understanding of the intelligence, or the intellect rather, right? So the intellect being that part of the human sort of reality where the divine light, as it were, shines. And so there's this sense of, to use some of the language that you use, sort of atemporality. It's sort of coming from on high. It's sort of immediate, and that's a far cry. I mean, that's very different from how intelligence is understood in a sort of everyday sense, in the context of artificial intelligence, in the modern context. Would you like to say anything on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, in terms of artificial intelligence and the kind of what exactly that intelligence is, which is being activated. It's essentially, it is this lower kind of intelligence which is severed from the active intellect. It's severed from any notion of a higher reality. And I think this is I think you actually find this in the very definition of some of the technologies which are used to make AI. So something which is really interesting is neural networks. And if you look up the very definition of a neural network, it's literally a system which is modeled to emulate the animal brain. And I think that's really telling. I mean, unconsciously, the language that's using,
the animal brain,
it's talking about the animal intelligence. And that intelligence is that which is erratic, that which responds to signals from external stimuli from the physical world, rather than anything more pure, or that which resides in the active intellect that we've been talking about. And the problem is that, as you were saying, because we're focusing on this kind of intelligence, this animal brain, as is encoded within the very definition of neural networks, this emphasis on the lower intellect, because we're imprisoned into that model of intellection, because we categorically deny the existence of anything higher, and more about that later. What that means is that the progress that we're making with AI, as you say, it's purely horizontal. It's not going anywhere. It's not, in Aristotle's triangle of ontology, it's not actually going from beyond the animalistic sensitive soul up to the intellect. It's staying within that realm. And Guénon talks about this. It's a purely horizontal development. So it's very easy to use language when talking about technological innovation like AI to say, oh, this is progress. This is such progress, right? No, it's expansion, but it's not ascension. It's not ascending anywhere. It's not technically to the definition of progress. It's not going anywhere more advanced, really, from a kind of
I mean, all this obsession with progress, right, is we're progressing to what? Towards what, right, is a question that doesn't come up often enough. I mean, the assumption is we're always getting better, right? This is kind of the whole myth of progress that really underwrites a lot of the modern project. But to your point, it's not. I had occasion to mention to my father actually earlier today, in the context. I was like, you believe in the theory of evolution, right? My father self-identifies as atheist, so he's an interesting cat. But I was like, you believe in the theory of evolution, and yet there's no evolution in your person. So it's why do I mention that? It's so my point is that I find it more interesting to think about the evolution of on a spiritual level, as opposed to on a purely material level. So we're progressing supposedly on the horizontal level. We're getting better and better, whatever that means, in some sort of superficial, I mean, I would contend ultimately in a very sort of on a superficial level, right? And who's the we in this discussion, right? Because I certainly didn't have any say in any of these, in the creation of these technologies, right? Most of us haven't had any say. So, but anyway, we supposedly are getting better and better. but towards what end, right? So we can crunch numbers really quickly, for example, right? So there's a very important distinction that has to be made between lower level intelligence in a sort of more mechanical sense versus wisdom. I felt this a while ago, that you know how people regularly will say, well, the state of the world is we're in the state that we're in today because there's not enough intelligence. We're not doing things. There's too much intelligence. Newsflash.
The wrong kind of intelligence.
It's just no wisdom, right?
Yeah,
It's because,
exactly.
right. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, because you were asking, I'm not sure if it was rhetoric or not, what actually is the aim of all of this? What are we progressing to? And as I think you yourself alluded to there, we're only progressing towards things which are serving the animal faculties. We're only really progressing to things which serve this very base level of intellect, namely, how can we get things more convenient? How can we get things more quickly? How can we gratify ourselves as quickly as possible? And the progress is limited to that realm. I mean, I've already discussed the idea of the active intellect, which is Aristotelian, though I'm interpreting it through an early Islamic theological lens. But you could also even bring in Plato to this idea of the lower soul. You're probably familiar with the analogy of the chariot and this notion that human rationality must tame the horses of spirit and of appetite. And in the Platonic imagination, such a central part of being human is returning to this kind of state of pure rationality. And okay, I sound like Kant there. I don't want to sound like Kant, but getting to a point where you can control these appetitive faculties and control.
Otherwise, they control us. Otherwise, they run amok, right?
And this is a huge kind of motif throughout this whole discussion, this idea of control and who is controlling what, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a lot. But in this particular analogy of the chariot, what AI is doing is it's actually allowing the appetitive horse to kind of take center stage, to lead and to reign superior, because. And this is a generalization, and I appreciate that there are artificial intelligence technologies being developed in the medical field and so forth. I would still include that under this umbrella, but it's a bit more niche, and maybe we'll have to explain later. But fundamentally, what we're seeing with AI is it is about convenience. It's about the appetite. It's about how can we please the appetite in a way which saves our time, saves our energy, and that thing, that those drives that comes from the lower soul, right? And you also mentioned, we become slave. We're going to become enslaved by the appetitive faculty.
We already have.
Yeah. And that reminds me of the Gospels. Those who take the sword, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And if you use that, if you apply that to the notion of materialism and this emphasis on the lower bodily, innovations, we will end up, if we put so much of our intelligence into this specific type of intelligence, then that will end up controlling us. That will be the center of our lives. I mean, it kind of already is, as you say.
Well, I mean, to very quickly occurred to me to mention a very sort of basic example, I guess, is revenge porn. There's this awful thing, and I just heard a news thing recently, a couple of days ago on whatever LBC. I just very quickly heard it mentioned. They're discussing it, and then so there's just what do we do about revenge porn, right? It's like it's a big problem, and for those who don't know what revenge porn is, if I'm not mistaken, it's people sort of jilted lovers. They sort of publish stuff about their former lovers, and it's awful, horrific. Now, the thing that occurred to me, and a question that's not being raised in this discussion at all, absolutely, revenge porn is terrible. Maybe it's porn itself that is a problem. Let's ask that question, right? I mean, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Those who live, I mean, this is tragic, and so many lives have been ruined, and will continue to be ruined. And this is just the beginning, as far as I can tell. This is only just the beginning. I mean, now, where technology is going now with. Again, this is AI-based technology, right? And people might be wondering why am I mentioning porn? But well, first of all, before going into this other thing, I wanted to mention something that's not realized by many people, which is mentioned in this documentary, Do You Trust This Computer, which is a brilliant documentary, which I highly recommend. everyone checks out. Some brilliant, very high-level thinkers in that, including Elon Musk and others, talk about the perils of AI. That it's mentioned that Google is Google itself, the search engine itself, is artificial intelligence. In any case, but with regards to porn, they have now what they call deep fakes, and literally through artificial intelligence, they can generate completely lifelike images of a person that they want to stick on a porn star's, sort of body, and it looks totally real. So this is the technology that we have now. Now they can do it with voices, like literally they can. This is weird stuff. I mean, I would say, to use theological language, I would say it's demonic. This stuff is really demonic.
I totally agree. I mean, one never wants to avoid getting too polemical or confessional, but I think in this situation it's so hard not to see this dimension of it, because it is the total inversion of the natural order. And another aspect of it as well, which is definitely worth discussing now we're on to theology, is the way that we are now in a position where we can intricately fabricate images and sounds which resemble people. It's essentially playing God in a way, because we're actually fabricating creation.
Wow.
But through our own resources. And I actually saw a deep fake this morning on Twitter. It's not a nice thing to see. It was a deep fake of Tom Cruise, and it was really, and it's funny because I've actually seen Tom Cruise in real life.
Oh, really?
When I worked at a Scientology event, but
no way.
Probably can't talk about that.
Yeah, I remember hearing you mention in your podcast on meme analysis that you worked briefly in Scientology. Oh, so you actually met Tom Cruise? Interesting.
I didn't meet him. I saw him,
yeah.
But it was just funny because I saw it and I was like, oh, that does seem to have his stature. I remember seeing from afar. And then I scrolled down a bit, and everyone was saying, oh my gosh, this is a deep fake. This is real. And just it was really, I mean, to be honest, I try not to expose myself to. I mean, well, I say this I'm using a computer and I'm using Google Docs in the background, right? But I try and avoid exposing myself to these images of artificial intelligence because they disturb me greatly, and I do find them genuinely very demonic. But I just remember looking at it and
I'm just going to turn that thing off because otherwise people keep messaging me. Keep going, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. But when you see it, when I do very rarely actually see it and see how lifelike it is, I feel I look at it and I mean, this is a creation. This is a fabrication, and instinctively it's not right for human beings to do that. I think that creativity is important, and for human beings to cultivate the arts and music and all these beautiful things which are in themselves quite evocative of God. That's understandable, but it's when they try and replicate it to such an exact degree and to manipulate it to say certain things, to do certain things, which is, by the way, an infringement on poor Tom Cruise. He didn't consent to this.
Well, I mean, the laws around this, they're non-existent. This is, but to your earlier point about the theological aspect of things and sort of creating, aping God and creating these sort of very lifelike images. And what's the biblical teaching? Thou shalt not create a graven image. And right, it's very, very clear. And I think there's a profound wisdom in that perspective. On the point of technology sort of progressing way more quickly than literally the law can keep up with. This is a huge. I mean, not only can the law as such, the laws keep up with all these developments, but we as a species, right? We literally, it's. I mean, how do we keep up with these insane developments, right? Things are progressing, right? That's sort of interesting word. At such an incredibly fast rate. There's well-known prophetic tradition, Islamic tradition, where the Prophet said, "Haste is from the devil." Like or speed. It can actually also be translated as speed. Speed is from the devil, right? So this sort of notion that we have these days, right, en masse. At least this is what we're made to believe, that speed is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Why is it necessarily a good thing? To actually create something of substance, right? I know I know older academics, more senior academics, they've commented on, and this is going back some years ago, that the moment we're in now is where it's just, you know, that there's not enough time spent deliberating just on on the level of academia. People kind of don't have that much time anymore to really formulate well thought out, like really well thought out. Not that people don't do it anymore, but if things are always geared towards production and speed, what does that do to us as a species? What does it do to our sense of self? What does it do to our sense of each other, how we relate to each other? If we see each other as sort of as images, right? Continuing on this idea of sort of manipulation of imagery. There's a few months ago, this kind of went viral. A few months ago, there was this image that Joe Rogan shared. I don't know if you saw it. It was of an apparently attractive young woman, and then but ever so slightly off-looking, but apparently attractive, right? And then comes Joe Rogan. Oh, he initially, I think he shared that initially, the image by itself, and maybe his commentary came later on. But in any case, turns out that image was of himself, but his daughter manipulated it on the phone. He said, like, this is crazy. My daughter, who I think at the time was not very old, 12, 13, whatever, spent maybe 10 minutes manipulating a picture of Joe Rogan, turning him into this attractive young girl or woman, whatever. And he said, this stuff is evil. I mean, regarding your point about not getting too theological about things, Joe Rogan literally used the word either evil or demonic. I forget exactly what. And he's not religious in a traditional sense. Elon Musk, who's definitely not religious in a traditional sense, he famously or infamously, however one looks at it, he said a few years ago, he was quoted as saying, I think he was speaking at Stanford or MIT, I forget. Anyway, he said that with artificial intelligence, we are unleashing the demon. Like literally, this is people who are not traditionally religious or theological at all are using this type of language, because I think sometimes we have to resort to this kind of language to make sense of the world. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned the hadith about speed being from the devil, because I mean, I won't claim, God knows best. I don't know exactly what that hadith means, but my immediate interpretation of that would be it's because speed and haste, it's this appeal to bodily faculties, it's this impatience, and patience is such an important part of religion. And Al-Ghazali has an absolutely beautiful treatise on patience and thankfulness, and he actually considers patience to be one half of faith, because the true mark of overcoming the bodily self and the worldly drives is being able to have patience and to be able to trust in God and trust in God's plan. And by appealing to speed and trying to make things happen at your pace and how you want them to happen, and to orchestrate things exactly how you want, everything to be pitch perfect how you envision it, that is, you're trying to have control over your fate. Trying to have control over your surroundings. And that, for Al-Ghazali, and indeed for most theists, is contrary to the nature of being human and being subservient to a divine order. And on that note, I actually wanted to mention something kind of quite generally in the realm of artificial intelligence and technology, and that is this idea of human beings taking too much control. For example, in the Quran, you've got the concept of mizan, balance. In Surah Ar-Rahman, it talks about, you should not transgress the balance. God has created things in an order which is finely tuned. And human beings, of course, we can innovate within that fine tuning. We can make the most of our resources to some extent, but we shouldn't transgress. That's the key word in this surah, and it's found in several places. And this idea of balance, mizan, and how human beings should respect that no matter what we do. We shouldn't try and supersede the natural order. And artificial intelligence, as we've been saying, it is the point at which the balance is overthrown, because we are now seemingly in control of so much, to the point where we're making it technology which is so advanced that it may even end up controlling us, and then you return to the you live by the sword, die by the sword. And it's quite terrifying to think about how that's going to pan out, because normally when you disturb when you disturb the balance, when you transgress the balance of nature, things usually don't end well. So I think that's a pretty much universal maxim, which people continually ignore in all aspects of politics, environmentalism, all of it really.
Oh, that's very profound. Thanks for that. The transgressing of the balance, and I mean, we have this notion, like and famously people talk about the Islamic tradition in this case. We're not only focusing on the Islamic tradition, but speaking of the Islamic tradition, that for now, that Islam is about the middle path, right? It's about balance. And of course, all the great luminaries in other religious contexts have always emphasized this, like the golden mean, famously, ancient Greek thought. But very often when we say that, I think we don't dwell enough on how that's not easy to do. Striking balance is a constant thing. We should always be questioning and sort of reflecting on what we're doing. It's how often do we hear of people who, let's say, had a certain upbringing, and let's say they grew up poor or had struggles growing up, and then they become so hyper focused on money that becomes their entire life. So it's one extreme to another, right? And the challenges in all walks of life, right, that we strike this balance, because when we become hyper focused on one thing, how is that tipping the balance then, right? And as far as in keeping with continuing with this notion of balance, and introducing and creating these technologies, and not only artificial intelligence, but technology as such, modern technologies. The famous and brilliant cultural critic, thinker, Neil Postman, he wrote in his book Technopoly, he makes this very profound point, which is obvious when we think about it, but it's not so obvious otherwise, which is that when a new technology is introduced to a system, it actually completely reconfigures the entire system. It's not additive, it's completely reconstituting. So this assumption, I mean, this sort of basic sort of what's the word, most non-thinking sort of assumption that I would contend most people have. Well, technology is just improving our lives. We had sort of primitive ways of doing things, and now we're so advanced, and things are continuously getting better, necessarily so, without stopping to think what are all these insanely capable technologies. I mean, I use the word insanely very intentionally. It's the mind boggles, and I think it's almost crazy what we can do. What these technologists can do. People with a lot of power and wealth these days, thinking about drone technologies and things like that. And there's a shift slowly but surely. I mean, there's a huge shift towards what's the word? Self-regulating, these autonomous drones, right? And so they will be guided by artificially intelligent systems. So then what? It's this stuff is very, very scary. It's very scary for me. And I can't remember where I was going with that beyond that. But if you wanted to pick up on anything or add anything, please feel free. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you've covered a lot of the aspects of this kind of sense of danger, because it is just evolving at such a pace, which we're not stopping to actually think what is the meaning of this, what are the long-term implications of this. And I don't just mean that at a pragmatic level, but I mean that at a spiritual level, which obviously I highly doubt that anybody in these tech offices is considering that, but that's part of the problem here.
It's a huge problem, yeah, because
we're rejecting, because all kinds of technological innovation operate mostly on Enlightenment premises, and so deeply embedded into the scientific method of the Enlightenment is this, well, two things. Firstly, it's the rejection of higher principles, and if they are there, they're not worthy of our inquiry. And secondly, the principle that human beings are in control of everything, and that all operations, scientific, philosophical, should be coming from a place of the self, and coming to affirm the self, or to produce something which can be used to affirm the self and its self-actualization.
The formula, just very quickly, the formula that is used a lot, and this sort of encapsulates what you just described. And I forget who it goes back to. It's an Italian thinker, if I'm not mistaken, but the formula is man is the measure of all things. But anyway,
yeah. But this idea is something which is, you know, subtly or not quite ubiquitous across pretty much all science in the Western Academy since the Enlightenment. It's this idea, you know, it kind of is, I think it starts from Descartes, this epistemic certainty in the self, and then that sort of flows into Kant with this idea of, you know, everything is about self-actualization and self-discernment. And then you end up with what we have now, which is a completely materialistic and ultimately individualistic. And I say that not in terms of each individual necessarily, but human-centric, based on the human individual as a category rather than any other kind of ontological category.
Without recourse to a higher principle, right? It's the human being in and of itself, himself, herself, is self-sufficient. And again, man is the measure of all things, or human beings are the measure of all things. And what is true begins and ends with me. What is false begins and ends with me, right?
Yeah.
Not with no recourse to any higher principles, right? What's the meme? That sort of silly meme where you have like a plate of spaghetti with someone's eating mixed up with Nutella, and then the caption is without objective morality, all things are possible. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is something which has only become catalyzed with postmodernism, right? But let's not go there just yet. But in terms of this notion that, you know, it's all about the self and this ultimate subjectivity, and central to that being the kind of severing of higher principles, you know, it's this being so dominant in the sciences, which is really catastrophic, to be frank. And the traditionalists have been saying this for a very, very long time. I find Hussein Nasr's writings on science particularly compelling. This idea that we need science to be re-enchanted, we need it to be connected to these principles, because otherwise it becomes so carried away with human ends. It never ends well. And this is exactly what we would, you know, just been talking about in terms of balance. And I think that this is so, it's quite stressful that, you know, we're talking about this now, and we're having a really interesting, I hope people find it interesting, discussion, raising some what I think are very important points. But because of this Enlightenment rationality, these points would never be taken seriously within the context of these scientific institutions.
Could I raise one point? So I'm with you. Absolutely, and everything you say, just to sort of suggest some things that maybe some critics would offer, which is, well, are you saying modern science is rubbish? Like modern science, we have all these incredible achievements. We have modern medicine, and I mean the very fact that you and I are connecting, it's through these technologies. And if it were not for modern science, and what would, I mean, I have some thoughts as to how I'd respond to that type of challenge. Because I think some criticisms that are leveled against people like Said Hussein Nasr, who again has played a huge role, as you know, as far as my own intellectual development over the years, certain critics have leveled against people like Said Hussein Nasr and others, the sort of traditionalists in general. They've said, well, these people, these traditionalists, perennialists, they have this sort of romanticized notion of the past, and it wasn't really all that hunky-dory. People died at a very early age, and people didn't have basic healthcare and antibiotics and things like that. And again, I do have my own sort of thoughts on that, but I was wondering, not to kind of put you on the spot, but to kind of put you on the spot.
No, I mean, well, to be honest, it's something that I do get asked quite a lot, because I wrote something fairly recently on this exiling of religious discourse from philosophy. And I had a lot of people, particularly those with things like ex-Muslim atheist in their bio, saying, "Oh, this is a really bad take. You know, what are you neglecting all scientific progress?" You know, it's absolutely not the case. What is so foundational to my point here is that science and religion are not mutually exclusive, and you can have a thriving scientific institution, you can have thriving science, but it needs some higher principles, I think personally, to ground it and to ensure that it's not transgressing a balance. You know, you mentioned previously that Islam is considered this kind of middle way, which is, you know, as you say, something quite ubiquitous, but I think Islam encapsulates it very, very well. You know, this idea that we can innovate to such an extent, but not to the point where it transgresses the balance. And I think that having some kind of religious undertone, some kind of spiritual, I don't like that word at all, some kind of theological undertone to our science, I think would just help to keep it in check, and we'd be more reflective and think, well, actually, what are the implications of this for our humanity? And that's what is, you know, the real crucial question here. And to put this into perspective, you know, I'm not just saying this because I get all of this sounds very idealistic. You know, one example I would look at is, for example, you know, the medieval Islamic world. I mean, you yourself, you just referenced modern medicine. I mean, a lot of that comes from the Islamic world, which was a deeply pious environment. You know, they were practicing medicine, yes, and discovering things, the nature of the physical world, but they were infusing those discoveries with the motivation to discover them for God's sake and to understand the nature of the divine. But
Ibn Sina's Qanun, Avicenna's encyclopedic, like literal sort of encyclopedic collection of healing modalities, was taught in Europe until the late 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. So, and that was how many hundreds of years this one person had immense impact. So exactly, yeah.
And even when it's not, you know, that people are directly reading Ibn Sina or directly, you know, that they are essentially reading them through other people, through other Western writers. I mean, that's a lot of sort of Islamophobic narratives will often discredit this and, you know, discount it, but it's very much true. You know, so much of what we know in the West was filtered through the Islamic world and came from a lot of Islamic ideas. And I say Islamic because, yes, they were dealing with the objective world. They were dealing with things which aren't inherently religious, but they infused them with a genuine conscience of where we are in the world and what our position of the world is in relation to higher principles, in relation to God. And I think that science thrived and could thrive where these principles, you know, it doesn't have to be evangelical or anything. I just think that they need to be there. They can't be rejected.
If a type of medicine works, one doesn't have to know if we're talking about traditional medicine, let's say, because there isn't just, I mean, there are all types of medicines, right? And historically, this was much more well accepted. But like, it's not necessary to ask the physician or the healer or what have you, what his or her theological background is, like, as far as benefiting from medicine, right? And to echo a lot of what you just said now, I mean, it occurs to me the sort of Edward Said. That's a weird Freudian slip. Sorry.
You did an MA at SOAS, didn't you?
Right. MA at SOAS, and also Columbia. Edward Said was a big.
Yeah, you know, just because. Sorry, not to distract. It's just often there is this Sadian slip if you've been to SOAS, you sort of just accidentally reference a
so interesting, because I haven't mentioned Edward Said consciously, or well, not. I mean, I haven't in conversation mentioned him in years. That's such a weird. Anyway, I guess I'm tired.
Maybe it's me. I'm giving off the SOAS.
SOAS
through the cyberspace. I don't know.
So not the Edward Said, but the Saidist and Nasser sort of understanding things, need for a sacred science, right? This idea of Scientia Sacra, and I mean, what we have to remember is, and remind ourselves really, that science as we understand it today, so modern science, modern Western science, not least of all, right, which has now become global, and through colonialism, this is very, very traceable and historic fact. That modern medicine, modern Western medicine, modern Western science was imposed on the colonies, and their more traditional forms of knowledge across the board were literally squashed, right? So the point being, science, as we understand it, or modern Western science, really, to be more specific, isn't the only form in which science can look. Like, it's not what we have today, right? And sort of speculative sci-fi writers, like steampunk, like what would the world look like, you know, if steam driven sort of contraptions took over the world, as opposed to sort of electricity driven contraptions, which is a very interesting theoretical exercise, again emphasizing the point that this need not, where we are today was not an inevitable part of progress, right? This is actually part and parcel of the sort of Foucauldian notion of power knowledge, right? That knowledge is always inextricably linked with power, and power means both sort of brute force, but also significantly money and where the funding is, et cetera, et cetera. So, so the type of knowledge that gets spread is, I mean, you see my point. It's not simply the case that this, you know, the better idea won. No, it's very often the case that the ideas that have won through power. Right. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest,
that was a big, long interruption.
I think that's actually a refreshingly useful way of applying Foucault. Because
well, Foucault, I mean, yeah, I mean, Foucault for me is, I know I've mentioned this before, he's a very complex thinker. And I mean, I think he's sort of very mechanistically reduced to some of these sort of talking points very often by people who haven't really studied him in great depth very often. But yeah.
So no, I mean, this is such a fertile area of discussion, and something which I'm writing quite a lot about at the moment, actually. And it's just seems such a strange paradox almost that we're living in a time which is so concerned with intersectionality and with power and with trying to analyze where are these power structures still lying. And
for listeners, sorry to interrupt again, for listeners who may not be familiar with the word intersection or intersectionality rather,
so I mean, intersectionality as in, how do you actually define it? I see it's such a buzzword. I mean, how would you define it?
I don't know if I'd be good at defining, but the sort of, so if we look at questions of race, right, that has to take into account questions of economics, has to take into consideration class and gender and things like that, and so it's how these multiple dimensions of personhood, I guess, sort of intersect and go into shaping a lot of the problems in the world and the abuses of power that happen and oppressions, right? I don't know if I did that justice.
I think that sums up quite well. Thank you. Yeah, it is actually quite hard because it's quite a sort of, it's used very often, but I think it's quite hard to actually encapsulate like that. So thank you.
No.
But one aspect of this intersectionality, it is belief and it is religion and it is where, how people's understanding of the world and people's metaphysics, right? And I just think it's slightly, well, I mean, it's deeply ironic actually that in this, particularly in the West at the moment, there is this huge attempt to be intersectional about every aspect of life, but when it
gives voice to the otherwise very often voiceless, right?
Yeah. But when it comes to matters of belief and of faith, these things tend to sort of be swept under the carpet. And again, another thing which has been huge in the past year, but I mean also going back to the past decade even, is decolonization. And that's all very well and good. And I think that the decolonization movement is very progressive. I won't go into that in too much depth, but there is this huge kind of gap because it's forgetting that so many of the axioms which we rely on when we approach these kind of critical theory and things like that, and relativism and liberalism, all of these, if this isn't too radical to say, all of these come from the same locus, which is the Enlightenment.
Right.
And we're still projecting these Enlightenment norms onto other cultures and onto other belief systems. And this is, I mean,
these are modern Western lenses through which we're trying to make sense of the world. And I mean, again, not to downplay the power of these lenses, but to say that this is the only way in which we make sense of things or empower people. Like, what are we removing from these discussions? Like, we're removing huge chunks, massive chunks of the human experience, and historically and even today, in terms of how people conceive of knowledge, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of coming full circle and talking about what is the position of technology within this. I mean, technology, particularly artificial intelligence, I would understand to operate on these very Western Enlightenment premises, namely that everything around us, the consequences of everything, can only be measured by physical effects, by measuring and calculating. So the impact of AI would never even consider more conceptual, spiritual dimensions, but rather just purely what are the material costs of this, what are the material risks of this. But most saliently, it's this Enlightenment premise that man and man alone is the center of, it's the central objective of all innovation and all progress, which, as we've already explained, is not really progress, it's just horizontal expansion. And so in this sense, AI is a direct child of this Enlightenment epistemic hubris, where it's all, you know, it's all very kind of centered around the individual, around human species. And I think there's a real worry that because we are seeing this AI as being the paradigm of technology, you know, what if other cultures start imitating this too? You know what I mean? That's very likely, because we see that with all kinds of other science, you know, the Western paradigm.
Well, this is a huge concern. No, absolutely. This is a huge concern, right? That the AI arms race that's happening, right? That's the sort of the quest to achieve artificial superintelligence. Basically create an artificially intelligent system which is literally more intelligent than human beings. So we have artificial intelligence in its everyday sense. And again, I mean, I've had people, so I've been a little obsessed with questions around AI for a number of years now. And I've been like, it's much more accepted in mainstream discourse now. Even 5 years ago, when I started to get really obsessed with it, I was posting stuff. I remember otherwise really intelligent people and sort of well-regarded people commenting, you know, Hasan, your kind of obsession with AI, it's like, what is this? Like, it's not gonna, it's not really, you know, this is impossible, right? And there are still many people are saying this, but and I think sadly, I mean, the people who, just because we can't imagine something happening doesn't mean that it's impossible for it to happen. And there's a huge amount of money and power being driven into the creation of what they call AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is basically an artificial intelligence system that can literally replicate everything that a human being can do. But the concern is, this is what AI theorists, like very serious people, like people who are both pro and against artificial intelligence, or you know, sort of at least saying, let's slow things down a little bit. They say, well, once we achieve AGI, what will happen? It will very quickly evolve into artificial superintelligence, where it will literally be more powerful than human beings, and at that point, most likely will be beyond our control. And someone like Nick Bostrom, who's is a philosopher at Oxford, and he also I think he founded as the head of the Future of Humanity Institute, if I'm not mistaken, and wherein they look at things like the existential risk posed by artificial intelligence, etc., etc. In his book, very influential book, Superintelligence. I forget the subtitle, Pitfall something, Pathways, Pitfall something, which people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk pick up and then have been hugely influenced by. He makes a very sort of basic, he says that it doesn't even have to be the case that artificial intelligence is like, you know, the Terminator scenario. It can be something very simple, like, you know, you program an artificially intelligent system to basically be optimized towards the creation of paper clips, let's say, right? And then all it does is it must create paper clips. Well, if that system becomes like goes out of control and we can't, it will literally, this is such a weird sounding, it will turn the entire world into paper clips. Like,
it's a bit like
something as dumb as that, you know.
It's like the Greek myth of turning. Is it Dionysius turning everything into gold? No, it's not Dionysius.
That's I know who you mean. The king, right? Midas, right. Yes. Yeah.
My pronunciation, you can just tell I have huge gaping holes in my common language.
No, it's perfect. Whatever. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But you know, is this? I mean, not quite the same thing, but as you say, this monomaniacal paperclip making AI. Turning everything into paper clips. He does have a very, this sort of story of Midas and the turning everything into gold, because that's the nature of automation. It's this one-track mindedness of these machines, and cognition doesn't work like that. Cognition takes into account so many other factors, most of those being very abstract senses of awareness, which you simply can't confined to a machine. I think this is what is so frustrating. Like when you hear these appraisals of AI technology, you know, they're going to emulate the whole human brain, everything about it, and it's, you know, well, perhaps the animal brain, but even within that notion, there is this inherent rejection of anything beyond that, and concepts which are beyond the physical animal brain. And
the animal brain is limited in any case, right? So we're basically we're creating this limitless, potentially animal brain, right? Which again, to your point, I think is a very, very important point that is worth repeating, that it's totally focused on the appetitive dimension. So if we're creating this monster potentially, which only is programmed to function on this level, what is the end result going to be of all of that, right?
What was that, a rhetorical question?
well, rhetorical or actual, yeah, either way.
I mean, I think
paperclips.
Well, paperclips, yeah, maybe. I mean, that would be quite funny actually. But I can think of far more malicious things. At least with paperclips, you can turn them into, I don't know, soldering iron, turn them into other things.
Right.
But I think, as you know, the kind of tangent, the line of thought that we've been sort of alluding to throughout is this idea of, you know, technology being focused around humanity, and how ultimately, and I mean the lower parts of humanity, and how ultimately that is quite demonic, because as soon as you focus purely on the kind of on the lower faculties, you have a society which is very animalistic and very almost barbaric, and that's what I mean. It seems far-fetched, but as you just said, I mean, a few years ago the whole notion of AI being so ubiquitous seemed far-fetched, so we can't rule it out. You know, the world could turn into, you know, a place where the appetitive faculty rules, and this is legitimated, but not only legitimated, but being actively created and fabricated and just spawned into every technology we see. This is the kind of brain which is ruling society.
Well, and this is actually also how we're controlled, right? The old Roman sort of tactic of bread and circus, right? But a point that I wanted to make earlier before I kind of sidetrack myself because of my ADD brain. I wanted to make the point about, you know, this sort of this arms race towards the creation of artificial superintelligence, right? And that whoever has artificial intelligence supremacy will literally rule the world. And China is a major player in all of this. And not only China, but China is a huge player in this. And what China is doing, for example, vis-a-vis the Uyghurs, right? It's horrific. I mean, they are literally, I mean, one shudders to even talk and think about what's being done. But these people are being targeted in a major way through facial recognition technologies, and they literally live in an open air prison, essentially, where they can't leave because the technology is so advanced that they can identify who's a Uyghur and who's not. And people can't leave from there, and not to mention, of course, the actual physical brutality that's being meted out on them. It's I'm not convinced that these technologies are always in our best interest. In fact, I would contend that more often than not always, but more often than not, even if these technologies may start with a good intention, right? The intention, at least stated intention, behind the creation of the internet was, I mean, it was literally described, I forget who described it as such, but one of the early pioneers of the internet as an extension of the brain, as something that will add to the brain, right? So, but and then Google infamously, they had the slogan.
Slogan.
You were there. But, don't be evil, right? And then so they literally, it's like tragically funny that they literally had to remove that slogan because legally, for some legal reason apparently, because they I mean, I think the way it's put is that they kind of are evil, and of course they're totally in bed with you know, the NSA and all these sort of Google has played a major role as far as propping up a lot of China's own artificial intelligence systems. So it's a big mess.
Yeah, exactly. And even again, you know, the nature of this competition is again something which pertains to this appetitive faculty. You know, it's wanting domination, wanting to rule. And again, we have this notion of false gods, right? And upsetting the balance to such an extent that human beings are the new gods, and artificial intelligence is part of that pantheon, I suppose, and it governs these techno deities, right? And I think that, you know, maybe that is maybe the end, you know, the end of humanity as we know it, this total inversion of the human being, going from a place of you know, being subservient to God. I think it's Peter Berger, the sociologist, talks about how, you know, historically human beings have always been, where they were always more conscious of fate in their lives, whereas modernity is characterized by choice and control by extension of that. And I think we're seeing this incredibly technologically exacerbated you know, obsession with choice and with preference and with human beings and with the preferences of humans, rather than
creating our own reality, right? Creating our own fate, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, that term, I don't know where I've heard that. I mean, I think you hear it in many different contexts, but the notion of kind of creating your own reality, that's always disturbed me for some reason. It really runs contrary to any kind of monotheistic or any, you know, theistic view. It's, yeah, playing God, and I think that sums up most of my feelings towards AI actually quite succinctly. You know, it's this obsessing the balance and replacing God with the lower soul, which is what we should be striving away from, not progressing towards.
Amazing, beautiful. And you know, with VR's coming very soon, virtual reality. I mean, with lockdown and stuff. I remember before lockdown happened, I was thinking, why would people ever adopt VR technology? It seems so weird, right? But then lockdown happened and it sort of extended. I was like, oh, now I know why people adopt it. So there's like, you know, I know people who are kind of buying, you know, these VR headsets, and it's like weird times. And what's the to try and end on a positive note? Like, what's the solution? What is there hope? Are we just going to be turned into paper clips and/or sort of, you know, the Matrix, I think, is a very powerful, Matrix, the movie, of course, is a very powerful metaphor for where we're going in many ways. I mean, it's not going to pan out exactly like that, I don't think, by any means, but I think some of the broad stroke themes are very powerfully insightful and made so many years ago now.
I think, yeah, to answer your question in terms of, you know, what is there any hope, I suppose, was kind of what you were getting at. And I think for a start, you know, there are people such as ourselves who are trying to sort of consider, you know, what are the metaphysical implications of AI, and people who are, you know, trying to go beyond the material and what we can prove and calculate. And I think that instinctively, I think human beings will always have that, you know, this is the concept of the fitra, right, in Islam. You know, there is always this inclination of God consciousness and this knowledge of something higher than ourselves, to use very agnostic language, just because it's more, you know, palatable, I guess, to people. But you know, there is, and even people, you know, will say, you know, there's this kind of spirit, right? And even if you don't believe in God, I think maybe it's
the force.
Oh well, yeah, could, yeah, if you insist, we could use that. But like, you know, but people do have this inclination. It's almost a magnetism, right, towards higher principles. And I think that although culturally we become so preoccupied with our own desires, with our own visions of progress, you know, we can kind of conceal these. I think at the end of the day, they will always remain, and as a result, you will always see some kind of backlash, even if that happens on the verge of destruction. You know, even if we get to a point where AI has caused so much imbalance and rupture, I feel like there'll always be some parts of us that realizes that it's instinctively wrong. And I do have a kind of faith in that. And I think it's interesting as well. Like, I think young people, although I don't think it's a necessarily conscious thing, I have noticed that a lot of the kind of trends in youth culture recently, particularly among, I mean, I'm Gen Z, I think, I don't know, like, but even younger, like my 14-year-old sister is often reporting to me all of the trends on TikTok and so forth. And even things like cottagecore, I know that they are very aesthetically based, and they seem
cottagecore.
Have you heard of it?
No. What is it?
It's basically this kind of how would you describe it? It's sort of aesthetic, a really popular aesthetic of young, mostly early teenage girls up to sort of my age, like kind of 20,
Mhm.
and they have this real desire to live in a cottage in the middle of
No
nowhere.
way.
Yeah, and have a farm and things like that. And
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's actually very trad, but I don't think that they know it. I mean, maybe they do. Like, I don't know. And I just think that you do see these currents in youth culture of wanting to go back to something more simple and something which is much more organic. Like I've seen a rise in things like localism recently, and people wanting to have a stronger sense of community, and in turn that will result hopefully in a society which is more aligned with nature.
Mm.
And of course, these things are not mainstream by any means. They're very much, people are very quick to kind of put all sorts of labels on those kinds of aspirations, but I do think latently they're there, and I think human beings will be hopefully drawn back to this wanting, this yearning for the natural order. And I think the most important thing is, let's just hope that doesn't happen when it's too late.
Yeah, well, I mean, no, thank you for all of that. No, you're right. I think we should always be hopeful, and this is the sort of religious spiritual imperative that ultimately, I sort of sometimes use this very simple theological formula, but I think it sums it up for me at least, which is to say that God is in charge. God is always in charge, right? And the Quranic sort of however we understand God and whatever our sort of specific religious spiritual leanings may be or may not be, whatever. But also in the Quranic narrative, right, and in the Quranic language, God says, "Do not despair of God's mercy." Right. So it's God's mercy is forever. I mean, we're bathed in God's mercy. It's just that we're not conscious of it. We're not cognizant of it enough. And this is sort of the real sort of religious spiritual task, right? Is to reorient ourselves on a daily basis, every moment, ultimately, ideally, where we are reorienting ourselves to the reality of the vertical dimension, towards the divine and to God. And then, I mean, I guess ultimately everything will be okay, because guess what? At the end of it all, we're all going to die anyway.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but
we forget that, though. I mean, to your point earlier, right, is that Peter Berger's notion of traditionally people being very aware of their fate, right, being very conscious of death, of their mortality, that what's the famous book, Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Denial of Death. I forget the author's name right now, but he kind of argues, and he's coming at it from a non-sort of traditional, non-religious spiritual perspective, but he argues that it's because of this fundamental awareness of our mortality that we go on to create all this sort of cultural production happens, etc., etc., which is probably partly true, no doubt. But I think we've and he wrote this a few decades ago now, but we've shifted from that notion writ large, right, to this notion that ultimately we're not going to die. I mean, the practice of meditating on our mortality is a very fundamental practice in all the religious spiritual traditions, right? And for a reason, because it's like the quickest way to reorient us towards the vertical. And not to go on and on about this, but I think as an addendum, an additional comment, and I had this in my messy sort of mind map, the notion of transhumanism, right? Transhumanists are these technologists, in many cases, very well-to-do people who literally believe, in keeping also with your very early point about the horizontalization of rationality, of being itself, right? So they, I mean, people, when we do away with an understanding of reality being both horizontal and vertical and sort of interpenetrating, and we just focus on the horizontal, then what we do, as in the case of transhumanists, they believe literally that they can achieve immortality through technology. And but that's like a whole other
yeah, so maybe we should do another episode on that, actually.
yeah, definitely. I love that. Yeah. But awesome. No, this was so much fun. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope
No,
that.
thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, me.